My name is Karis Palmer. I'm editor at iTnews, and I'm fortunate enough today to be talking to you about the NBN, with a caveat of I'm not going to talk about the NBN and the politics of the NBN. So this will hopefully be a semi-technical discussion about the enterprise implications of the NBN. NBN Co has recently put out a white paper on all of those issues and what organisations should be thinking about now, and also NBN Co itself has a transition sort of team, as I understand it, that will be working with enterprise if they're not already starting to over the coming months. But of course, having said that, in between all of this happening, an election was called, which means that NBN Co unfortunately is not able to be here today because of the caretaker convention. But having said that, I'm very fortunate to have a couple of really interesting people on a panel to talk about the same issues, and that's Tony Brown, who's a analyst of operator strategy at Informa, and Richard Constantine, who is Professor, Pro Vice Chancellor and CIO at Flinders University. So we've got the analyst view, I guess, and also on the other side, the use case view. So I think we should be able to have an interesting discussion. So I might start by asking the audience, how many of you have actually started planning or doing any work related to the NBN? 1, 2, 3, a few. That's great for an audience of this size. That's pretty good. And how many of you, I guess, have started talking to your telco or your networking provider about the NBN? Yeah, a few more. Cool. All right. So, with that said, I'm interested to hear from you firstly, Tony, what you think the shift from copper to fibre ultimately will mean for larger organisations. There's a whole heap of game-changing things, but I think specifically for the enterprise.
Okay, well, really, to give you some idea of my background, I spent a lot of time travelling up in Asia. I've been going up to Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, Korea, you know, for about the last 13 years. And so I've really seen fibre develop in those countries from where it was in, say, 2000 to where it is now. And so the important thing, I know we're not going to go into the politics of this, but the important thing really is to view this as a much longer game than perhaps our politicians might like us to think about. You know, when you look at how fibre has developed in those very advanced fibre markets, Korea, Japan, Hong Kong even, you know, this thing has happened over a very long period of time. So no matter what the strategy is, the important thing to remember, and of course politicians aren't very good at doing this, is to keep expectations realistic about what can be achieved and how long it will take to achieve that. If we look at what happens in what's happening right now in Japan and Korea, so one of the things that we have to think about as enterprises is how to deal with taking legacy systems out of the equation and moving towards an all IP infrastructure. Well, if you look at what's happening in Japan, where they've had broadband, very fast broadband for probably 15, 16 years at a consumer and an enterprise level, and even in Korea, they still, in those countries, very advanced countries, are still dealing with the problems of removing these legacy components. So really, from an enterprise perspective, I think realism and what can be achieved and how long it will take to achieve it is probably the number one thing enterprises need to bear in mind. This isn't going to happen overnight. It's a very long transition towards where we get in the end. And obviously where we get in the end is our very high-speed, ubiquitous networks and you moving to an all IP-based world. That's going to take a long while to get there, and there's going to be lots of challenges for enterprises in moving from the old world to the new world. So there's certainly plenty to think about.
Thanks, Tony. And Richard, obviously from your point of view, the big picture things, I think we all know there's a lot to be excited about in terms of what you can do, but what are some of the specific things you're thinking about you have to get ready for now?
Yeah, so our focus is mainly around the really the educational sort of benefits and opportunities. And so things like, cloud-based applications, HTML5, digital TV, internet TV. Most of you would have heard about MOOCs, massive online open courseware, blended learning, flipped learning, and which is all about online learning. So students being able to not be on campus, and we're lucky that within Australian universities we've got a super massive sort of high-speed network called AARNet. So if you're on a university campus, you're pretty well connected. And that's really not the issue. It's for students that want to engage with the university and they might be disconnected from the main campus at another location. Maybe staff, maybe researchers that want to actually research and gain access to some big data. and you've heard that terminology no doubt here at the conference and probably elsewhere. This is really, I think it's the start of a massive game changer, and that's why it's so exciting. We talked about copper and fibre, and I won't get into the politics because I did have a discussion with a politician a while back, Liberal versus Labor, about their different strategies. I think the disappointing thing is that I don't know if it's that simple really, because I know that I used to live in Melbourne and I had 100 megabits. I think they were trialling some new service with one of the major carriers. It was a great connection. I moved to Adelaide and I'm about 3.5 kilometres from the city. I'm in an old home. It's an 1890s home. I've got to get around to it. I've got to get an electrician to run new copper wiring within my house, because I reckon that's probably a problem. Because I look at the side of the house and I see this wire sort of getting moved along. But I don't think it's any better when it goes into the pit either. So I think if you have got a clean connection, whether it's copper or fibre, you probably will. It depends how far you are from exchanges and things. But I think the NBN will give us sort of like a game-changing sort of experience. We'll be able to do some new things that we just can't do today. And I know that, and the reason why I'm harping on about the change in capital city is that when I go to websites now where there's a video, it's like watching, grass grow, like it's slow. And I'm in a capital city, so I've been looking at the map for the first time to see when the NBN's going to come around in my suburb, because I want to jump on as quick as possible, believe me. So it really will be a massive game change, especially in education. And we can talk more about that if people are keen.
There's obviously a lot going on behind the scenes, but I get a sense working and talking to people at the moment that everyone's just holding their breath to see what happens at the election. That said, we will be getting fibre and copper will be starting to be progressively turned off, and that is a very real thing for the enterprise. So what are some of the things, Tony, that enterprises should be doing now, putting aside what happens in terms of fibre to the home versus to the node, to prepare?
Well, one thing that I touched on previously was this emphasis on legacy systems. So when we talk to our clients of ours in Korea, Japan, one of their big expenses is if a lot of them now regret the fact they didn't put enough thinking into how they would transition from all the different legacy systems that they're using, copper-based systems, analog-based systems, into an all-digital IP-based network. Some of them got it right by planning in advance, and some of them left it way too late and have been left running two lots of systems. And of course, as the legacy system gets turned off, sometimes you get marooned with an old system that doesn't work anymore. So planning in advance is absolutely critical. Talking to the service providers who are providing those old systems and working out what turn-off dates are, how you can work together towards that turn-off date, etc., etc. And some of these guys in these APAC markets where fibre has been around for a long time now, because they didn't provision in advance of to how to move to this new world, they got quite badly burned, and some of them lost quite a bit of money because they didn't plan in advance for how they would manage that migration. So really managing the migration from the legacy world, from the old world to the new world, is critical, and that requires plenty of forward thinking.
For sure. Thanks, Tony. So in terms of telco contracts, they're usually quite long term. In terms of when organisations should be speaking to their provider, what are some of the things they should be thinking about? Is now the time to be doing an audit of that network agreement that you have?
Again, one of the big things we found from talking to people about this is when the enterprise is thinking about migrating to this new network, is to find out what's available by moving to IP. What advantage do I gain? Because a lot of companies we spoke to, a lot of telcos who were selling enterprise services, so KT in Korea, for example. Now, if you're KT in Korea or NTT in Japan, and you're going out there talking to IT companies or software companies, generally these sort of companies are quite clued up about what this move means, right? But what they found was that when they moved into other areas of the economy in these countries, so the manufacturing sector, for example, lots of these companies who were in non-IT based sectors really had very little idea about what this move to IP meant and what this meant in terms of new applications, new services, etc., etc. So often we found that telcos made the mistake of thinking that all their customers were alike, right? When in fact their customers, maybe 25% in the IT sector, had a very good grasp on this, right? And all they really wanted was was the extra bandwidth, and they could manage the transition for themselves. But lots of customers in other markets, especially medium-sized companies, manufacturers and so on, they found themselves really asking the telco, okay, what does all this mean? What does this mean for me? And so what we really came away with, what the telcos said to us, these guys offering very high speed bandwidth, was we really wish we had a way of communicating with our customers, and so we could really they could ask us and we could tell them what this process means, what the new services are, etc., etc. So having a good dialogue with the telco and working out what you can actually do. And also the one thing lots of the telcos said was they found often their customers were too afraid to ask. They were too afraid, they were ashamed in some ways of not knowing what they didn't know, and so they were too afraid to ask questions of their telco, their service provider, and they missed out on some opportunities they could have had if they'd had a better dialogue with their operator.
Cool, thanks Tony. Are there any questions from the audience? I've got quite a few more, but I just thought I'd throw it out there at this point, or at least say to you if you've got anything, now's your chance, and we'll come back after. There's one at the back.
Tim Fleming from Deloitte. I was recently at an event where I was listening to Malcolm Turnbull talking about what the Liberals plan, and there was the topic brought up of possibly going back to Telstra because they'd have to, if they're going to continue using parts of the copper network, they'd have to be renegotiating with Telstra. I just wanted your point of view on how practical you thought that was.
Well, from what Malcolm said, and I've met Malcolm a number of times over the last couple of years, and we've sort of exchanged ideas about what his policy is, etc., and some ideas there. I mean, this is the great big elephant in the room, isn't it, about what happens with Telstra. What Malcolm's been saying recently is that basically he feels that they've got a good chance of going in with negotiations with David Thodey and basically getting the copper for a very low price, if not nothing. His argument being that the price of copper is already negotiated into the existing contract with Telstra, that because Turnbull's argument is the copper's being turned off anyway, so really why would you pay any more for it? Of course, you'd rather be in Thodey's position than Turnbull's in that negotiation because, Thodey doesn't have to sell his copper, whereas Turnbull does. So will he get it for free? I mean, maybe. If Thodey's feeling particularly generous that day, I suppose he might get it for free. It would be doubtful, though. He'd have to use the copper. But, of course, the other thing that Malcolm doesn't know and he needs to know is what is he actually buying, right? I mean, what he's talking about now is doing VDSL vectoring, which works over 400 metres, maybe doing G.fast, which works over 100 metres. Now, from what we've spoken to vendors out there, Alcatel, Lucent, Huawei, and a lot of operators, across the world, Telecom Argentina, that I've, spoken to, a whole bunch of operators. Now, this copper acceleration technology, it is designed to work on mediocre quality networks, right? It's not designed to work on new copper. It is designed to work on copper that's 30, 40, 50 years old, okay? So it will work on networks on copper that's not optimum, right? But there is a limit to where it will stop working, okay? If the copper's too badly degraded, it won't work. And so what Malcolm is going to have to find out before he agrees to pay for the copper or agrees to pay for a lease for the copper is what condition is that copper in? How much remediation work do I have to do? How much is that going to cost me? At what point do I decide the copper's so badly degraded I can't use it and I might as well introduce fibre to the home anyway? So before he really can talk to Telstra, he needs them to tell him what state is this network really in? How much of it can be used for vectoring and how much you basically have to replace with full fibre. So before he can really make an offer, he's going to find out what he's buying, and that's the tricky thing to find out.
I hope that they don't buy the copper around my place, that's for sure.
Thanks, Richard. And we said we wouldn't talk politics, but that's all right. If anyone else has any politics questions, I'm sure Tony will be happy to answer them. Richard, I wanted to talk specifics about the things that you're thinking about in terms of cloud services, but also other things like voice over IP and IPv6. Are they on your radar in terms of being easier to enable under NBN?
Yeah. So, as I said, I think the universities have probably been at a faster rate for quite a while. So we've already been experimenting with IPv6. Most of us have got IP telephony already. I think it was early 2000s that at my previous university we introduced that. Toll bypass. So if you're phoning another state, the call goes through the ARNet network and then jumps off locally as a local call in the state. So there's been a whole lot of smart things that have gone on over the years because we've had that high connectivity. The things that are of interest, like I said, is for example, a lecture goes on at a main campus, and in the past, you could watch a video after the fact, probably download it and review it. But we're probably interested in students having an interactive and real-time experience and in high definition. And the other night, my daughter was watching, she gets on YouTube and watches different films and things, and I saw one that was in just standard definition. And I was shocked that she could even put up with it. That's how bad it was. And I just think back that a few years ago it was the norm and we were used to it and we accepted that. And we'll probably look back one day when we've got, we won't accept anything that, most of you that used, video conferencing, Skype, etc., would be used to varying quality. And I can guarantee that once the NBN's rolled out, we'll probably be a lot fussier. Probably our expectations will go up with the sort of quality that we'd expect. The other thing too is the applications from application providers or the telcos and so forth. I think we really haven't scratched the surface of that either, because you were talking about that before. That really, even shopping, purchasing items through the internet. Once you've got that interactive opportunity, I think that's what I'm talking about as a game changer, where you'll be able to, perhaps have a discussion without it being like a bot or someone that you're talking to that isn't really a human being at the moment. The little box goes up and you talk to someone. But imagine having a face there, chatting away, talking about what you want to buy or what you're inquiring about. I just think that would be a great opportunity. Also, telehealth. So we've got a project now at Flinders University where we're working with the aged, and they've all got an iPad at home and they're having sessions with their health provider and it is an NBN funded sort of project. So it's in areas where the NBN's already rolled out in South Australia. So that's of great interest. The other thing too is that, as it rolls out everywhere, things like, we look at our cars and things and, I'll probably think about a whole lot of things, but one of the massive trends that they're talking about in the next couple of years is wearable technology, where it's always connected to the internet. It was in a Horizon report earlier this year, which is, forecasting the future. And there's also there's a lot of discussions now going on about the Internet of Things and the Internet of Everything. And we know that the time will come where everything will be connected all the time. Now, in some ways that's scary because they probably know where we are every minute of the day and what we're doing. But I think that's where we're going with this sort of technology as it rolls out, because we'll have obviously the physical bound sort of infrastructure with fibre, but we'll also have high-speed wireless connected to it. And we'll open up new opportunities then. So imagine having gigabit wireless connected to the NBN. All of a sudden, a whole lot of devices. And I think from a health point of view, I've been astonished for years that our cars have got dashboards and they've got diagnostics going on. When your car's overheating, how it's running all the time. And as far as people go, we haven't even invested that in us. So what's your blood pressure at the moment? What's your sugar levels? We'd have no idea. I think that this is the opportunities that will come, where people can subscribe to a service. Imagine in China, giving them a device that they can wear, and it's constantly monitoring them, and then you can roll that out into other countries as they get things equivalent to the NBN going. I think that's great opportunities. So if you've got people that got money and they're willing to spend the money, there's a lot of services that you can sell to them.
All good things for researchers, I guess, at
Sorry,
universities.
just on the healthcare factor, that's a really interesting point that Richard's made there. But there are clearly huge prospects for healthcare without any question. But one thing we've seen in some markets is the resistance to change from, we might call, incumbent forces, right? So, for example, in Hong Kong, the incumbent telecom operator there, PCCW, or HKT, they're called again now, they have got a very good e-health solution, right? And they've spent a lot of money, and it's a very, very good solution. But the problem they've got is when they've gone to the government in Hong Kong and said, look, we're developing this e-health solution. We really think this can work to lower healthcare costs. It'll work for consumers are going to love it because it's going to give them access to health information in their home. No need to see a doctor. It's going to lower prices, etc., etc. Of course, when they go to the health authorities, right, who've got their walled garden, they control all the health information, all the hospitals and so on, they say, well, hold on a minute, you're a telco. What's this got to do with you? Why should we share this data with you? You're a telco. You're a private company. This is nothing to do with you. So these barriers that are there are really, really interesting because, yes, change is without doubt possible, but you've got established interests there who are going to say, well, hold on a second, health is our domain, not yours. Why are you getting involved in this? And last year we were in Korea talking to the Koreans about this, and this is what I was saying to Cherries before, we met a guy who was the telecoms advisor to the Korean president, and he said, look, in Korea we don't have a technical problem with healthcare. We can move it technically like this today. The problem we have is a people problem, in that the established doctors in the system who are 50s and 60s, they are not interested in doing teleconsulting, whatever. The younger doctors in their 20s and 30s, they want to do this, but the established, the guys who have the seniority are very conservative and don't want to change. So what can be achieved technically is very impressive, very interesting, but often there are established forces within systems that stop that change from happening maybe quite as fast as it might otherwise happen, which is very interesting to consider.
I mean, to me, the thing that CIOs are going to be caring about right now is how much do I have to be worried about the rapid take-up of this when it starts to happen, because it wouldn't be the first time that change had sort of happened faster than people had forecast. So, in terms of timeframes and cultural adaptation, what sort of timeframe would you put on it, Tony?
Well, when you talk about the ability to move quickly, that's a really interesting point, because in so many markets we've seen the big players get caught out by small, nimbler players, and a really good example of this would be in the CDN market, so content delivery market, right? Content delivery network market, where you saw a company like Akamai, okay, which obviously I'm sure most people would know Akamai. Really, for a long while, the telcos looked at Akamai and said, this is not our business. These guys are in the CDN business. We don't really want to, we're not really interested in that. And of course, as the internet got bigger and bigger and bigger, the telcos suddenly realised that Akamai had achieved a massive market presence, right? And the telcos have spent the last, 3 or 4 years trying to wrest market share back from Akamai, which has proved extremely hard to do. So the earlier you get involved in this, the better, because there are companies out there who will get involved early in these internet-based businesses, Akamai being a classic example. And once they're in the market and established, it's very hard to shake them out again, because Akamai now, really, you look at them in the CDN market, they control a huge chunk of the CDN market because they got there first, right? And so the longer you leave it on a global web-based business, the harder it is to shake out the established players. I mean, we've seen in the CDN market, Telstra, KDDI, NTT, BT, Deutsche Telekom all have a go at trying to launch their own operator-based CDNs. But of course, by the time they've launched those CDNs, Akamai already has its own global CDN that's extremely hard to compete with. So the longer you leave it on the internet market, on a very fast-changing technology world, the harder it is to actually compete with those guys who got in first.
Any more questions in the audience before I keep going? No? Okay. Oh, there's one.
Bruce Windsor. Just wondering whether you'd like to make a comment on the other technologies. There's fibre, obviously. If you live in a metropolitan area, fibre's great. You live in a regional area and you're probably going to end up with wireless. And at the moment, wireless is, I think it's about 25 meg down and 5 meg up. And if you move out a bit further, you've got satellite. Have you got any comment about what the new, maybe the technologies for satellite might be in the next maybe 2 to 3 years, and what sort of speeds, and where that might be with NBN?
Do you have Richard?
Well, look,
You've got some regional outlets to be worried about, haven't you?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And at the moment, most of the things that we've been working with is the actual physical fibre rollout across regional. So I know that they're doing what they can there. The other thing too is that I'd heard that there was, I think the NBN was looking at some new satellite and wireless technology, but I'm not aware of what the speeds will be. But that's a good point. So I probably agree with you that it's pretty slow, and they probably do need high speed connectivity, but there's limits to what you'll get if you've got a satellite connection or a wireless connection.
Yeah, I mean, satellite capacity is always going to be a big problem. I mean, it's back in 2005 or 6, we saw the Thai company Thaicom launch the IP Star satellite, which is involved in the currently supplying services in Australia. And this satellite was going to be the big thing that delivered rural broadband across Asia very fast and all the rest of it. But of course, providing a service by satellite is very expensive. There's limited bandwidth available, and even when you compare it with LTE-based mobile broadband, it just doesn't stack up in terms of price, right? I mean, you're just consuming what data is just so expensive via satellite compared to LTE. So in those rural areas, And this is a question we're seeing across the world, right? So in the US, we're seeing the big telcos there, the Verizons, AT&Ts and so on, putting a big emphasis on providing LTE as actually a home-based broadband service rather than running a fixed connection to the home, because LTE is so much cheaper. Of course, what you get with LTE is very high speeds. And in the UK, when you look at what EE launched in the UK on 4G in the UK, TD-LTE, they were getting, like, at launch 75 meg download, right? That will get slower as more and more people come onto the network. So LTE has a huge role to play in this. Satellite will always be limited. That's the nature of the beast. But mobile broadband via LTE is going to have a huge role to play. But of course, the problem is you get the speed, but not the capacity, and that's very, very hard to get around.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the other things too is it's just astounding the sort of cost. Like, I think that's got to change as well. Like, I just think that the cost of connecting people that perhaps haven't got fibre to the home or fibre to the node or whatever, or copper to their home, if they're on LTE or if they're, or if they're using satellite, like, I just think that the costs of all this sort of connectivity here in Australia is quite high compared to the rest of the world, and that's probably a bit of a hurdle as well. Like, even the cost of probably getting an NBN connection will probably be high. So that's something that I think the government's got to sort of like sort out, because if it's not affordable, then it probably won't be used, and it will be like limited. So,
all things we may know more about in a couple of months' time. Fast forward a little bit to, say, 2 to 3 years where fibre is more prevalent, even in regional areas. And what are some of the considerations for you, Richard, in terms of what that might enable when it is ubiquitous? In a utopian world, I guess at the moment we can talk about it, but really what you hope it will ultimately lead to.
Yeah, so look, Flinders is quite unique that, I suppose there's a number of medical schools, but we focus on rural and remote medicine as well. So we've got students that do clinical placements right across South Australia and also in the NT. And I've been to, so one of the sort of sites is, and I don't want anyone to laugh, but it's at the Barossa, which was a good place to visit. And it's really just a home, and it's just where students pop in, and there might be about a dozen students that go there. I think it's shared with the University of Adelaide as well, and they can tune into some classes that are going on. They get placements out at GP clinics, and they work from that town. So once the NBN rolls out, it's going to mean that they've got better connectivity back to home base, back to the campus, back to their lecturers. You can then engage them with telepresence. They could be on an iPad and get a high definition video experience using Jabber. So that will open up huge opportunities. The other thing too is just engaging with communities across the country as well. So the other thing too is like I talked about before, and we were talking about earlier about MOOCs and delivering content. So you want to deliver high definition content to as many people as possible, to provide educational type services, and I think that will be great opportunities for that in those remote areas where it's difficult for them to get the services. The other thing too is that you may have students that are doing some online learning, and they may be in a whole lot of different disciplines, and they may be in a rural or remote sort of site. Now I'll just give you the example. So you might have 3 students doing a Bachelor of Arts, you might have a couple doing a science course, and because they may be first generation university attendees in the family, they statistics show us that they require quite a bit of support. So just the support things like how to write an essay, how to do research and use online resources to get the latest journal articles. It's all common things to students. It doesn't mean it's just because of that discipline. So having the NBN and having that high definition opportunity with telepresence or video conferencing allows you to put that support into that community. So it can be done in a community centre where you could have all first year university students that are doing online studies attend, and you can provide a personalised experience to those students to ensure that they don't drop out of their course, that they stick with it. They may do the first year still within their hometown, and then look at moving and coming and staying at the university in capital cities and so forth. So there's those sort of opportunities, but you've got to have really good connectivity to provide those services to those people. But that's the sort of things that we're thinking about as well.
Absolutely. I guess, Tony, I'll ask a question that you'll probably say, well, if I knew that, probably I'd be earning a lot of money working for the government or NBN Co. But there seems to be a sense that the overall selling of the NBN and the vision for what it might be able to do hasn't yet cut through, and certainly that has fed into some of the politics that we've seen. And as an IT journalist, I know I'm kind of preaching to the converted with this audience in that, you know, most of them are obviously quite sold on fibre. But what, from your point of view, are some of the visions and the kind of ideas that for an enterprise we should be talking about as we sort of start to care more about what we're ultimately going to end up with post-election?
From an enterprise perspective, I mean, from a consumer perspective, we all know video will be the great driver, both the uploading of video or other content and also the downloading of video, viewing of video. From an enterprise perspective, from what we've seen elsewhere in the region, the more advanced fibre markets, there's a couple of very interesting trends. The first one is telecommuting. Now that's probably been overstated a bit, right? Now, obviously, high-def video conferencing is very, very good, but from what we've seen in other markets, that's tended to be an accompaniment to traditional work practices rather than a complete replacement. So the idea that everyone leaves their office and then works from home full time that's not quite right. What we've seen happen in other markets is that what the fibre to the home enables from an enterprise is to have its workers work from home and have high definition conferencing when they need to, rather than full time. Because obviously, in lots of these places, culturally, and even in Australia, to a lot of people, it's very important to actually have a physical presence in the office in case so your boss can see you're there, and you're there first thing in the morning and last thing at night, and you're a very conscientious worker, right? And so that's so if you're at home, if you're not being seen, obviously that's a problem. That's actually a real issue, because we've seen some companies in Korea that we've worked with have tried to encourage telecommuting, and people have been very cautious about doing it because they don't want to be seen to be not in the office. They want to actually be in the office. Other things we've seen in other markets that are really kicking off really quite strongly, and this would definitely apply in Australia, and it's already happening now, of course, is the use of cloud services, cloud computing at an enterprise level, of companies moving everything over to the cloud, right? I mean, that's going on now in Korea, Japan, very aggressively, in Singapore, very, very aggressively. The interesting thing that we see in terms of cloud services, right, is who is going to supply those cloud services? Who are going to be the companies that control the value chain in cloud? Because, again, as it is in the CDN market, we see a contest taking place here between the local telcos, Telstra, Optus, Vodafone, whoever else, and these massive global companies. Now, unless you're involved in the industry, you probably, the average consumer wouldn't really know that for the last 3 or 4 years, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, they're creating these huge back-end infrastructures to allow them to serve both enterprises and consumers. And we've spoken to these guys. We spoke to Amazon Web Services back in March at our conference in Singapore, and they see the enterprise sector globally as a massive opportunity for them, right? A huge opportunity to supply these cloud services, web acceleration, and so on to enterprises. So the question is, who's going to win that battle between the global giants and the local telcos? The local telcos obviously want to be in this business, right? They want to supply you your cloud solutions and the rest of it, but these global giants can do it much cheaper. The problem is as a customer, the enterprise customer's got to decide, well, do I go with the telco, who can be quite expensive, but at least if something goes wrong, I can contact them and I can get a solution, or do I go for a cheaper solution from a global player like Amazon, whoever, where, yes, it's cheaper, but if something goes wrong, then what do I do? So this choice going forward on enterprise about the choice between a local telco and a global player is going to be really interesting to see what people go for, and that's going to be fascinating.
Already being played out, I think, for sure. If you can join me in thanking Tony Brown and Richard Constantine.
Thank you.